Perhaps, the mechanic replied, running a hand along the Jeep's flat fender, but this is not about fine engineering. This is about practical engineering. He gestured toward the open engine bay. Every part here can be reached in seconds. No hidden bolts, no need to remove 3 assemblies just to reach a 4th. You can repair it in a ditch, in the rain, with 1 wrench. Hours, he paused, as though reluctant to speak the truth. Hours demand workshops. Precision tools. Specialists. The officer's expression hardened. You mean it's crude? The mechanic smiled faintly. Crude, yes, but clever. It sacrifices elegance for endurance. It's made for men, not for manuals. The other officers exchanged glances. Beyond them, the Jeep sat idle, mud drying on its tires, sunlight glinting off its simple lines. In its unassuming steel, they saw something quietly alarming, not sophistication, but scalability. That realization spread through the German staff faster than any engine could turn. This was the true power of American industry, not in brilliance of design, but in the ability to build millions of good-enough machines faster than perfection could ever be produced. In that moment, standing beside the captured Jeep, they understood that the war of machines would not be won by craftsmanship alone. It would be won by simplicity, standardization, and supply, the kind of genius that built strength by the thousands. It was something far more dangerous. The senior mechanic closed the hood slowly, as though sealing away an uncomfortable truth. They build for war as it is, not as it should be, he murmured. Our engineers build for ideals, for precision, balance, performance. But this, he tapped the Jeep's fender with a grease-stained knuckle. This is built for chaos. One of the officers scowled. You mean to say the Americans have out-engineered us with this? Farm tractor. The mechanic shrugged. They've engineered for the soldier, not the engineer. Any man can drive it, fix it, or strip it for parts. That is genius of another kind. He pointed again to the transfer case lever. 1 lever. No linkage adjustments, no synchronization, no alignment tools. It just works. Always. And if it doesn't, it can be made 2 with a hammer. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. The conversation that followed was quiet, almost reverent. They had been taught that German machines were the pinnacle of precision, that every bearing, every bolt was the product of superior thought. Yet here, in a squat American vehicle built from stamped steel and compromise, lay a form of superiority that their doctrines had never considered, the supremacy of simplicity. Outside, the desert wind stirred dust around the tires. The Jeep seemed to sit there, unbothered, patient, as if it had nothing to prove. It did not gleam with polish or precision, but with purpose. The mechanic stepped back, wiping his hands. This vehicle, he said finally, was not designed to win awards. It was designed to win wars. The officers gathered closer as he spoke, the desert heat forgotten. Every corner of this vehicle, the supply officer continued, is a compromise not of quality, but of philosophy. They have accepted good enough as a virtue. He ran his hand along the rough casting of the block. See these surfaces? Not polished, not precision ground. That saves time, saves tools, saves money, and because they all build to the same standard, any block fits any vehicle. No hand fitting, no remachining, no delays. This is industry as a weapon. The mechanic who had first examined the Jeep nodded. Our factories produce masterpieces. There's produce armies. Someone laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. And they have more factories than we have masterpieces. The supply officer straightened. Exactly. We pride ourselves on excellence. But excellence takes time. Time is the one resource we cannot manufacture. The Americans have built a machine for mass production, for replacement, for momentum, for attrition. He pointed to the Jeep's data plate, stamped simply with serial numbers and service marks. Each one of these can be built by semi-skilled labor in plants spread across a continent. We, on the other hand, depend on craftsmen and specialists. When we lose a vehicle, we lose weeks of production. They lose one and roll out 10 more. The assembled men were silent for a long moment, the truth settling over them like dust. The war had been fought so far with the belief that superiority of design could overcome inferiority of numbers. But standing before that squat American machine, they saw the flaw in that belief. Perfection, they realized, was not the future. Production was. The supply officer looked up from the open engine bay, eyes narrowing as if seeing the war itself in a new light. If their tanks, their trucks, their planes are built with the same thinking, he said quietly, then this, he tapped the Jeep's hood, is not just a vehicle. It's a warning. Each new report told the same story in different words. The Americans were winning not through brilliance of design, but through the industrialization of practicality. By early 1943, these analyses had begun to circulate among senior engineering staff in Berlin. The tone was unmistakably uneasy. The Wehrmacht's technical branches, so long confident in their precision, their craftsmanship, their superiority of materials, were now confronting a new kind of enemy, one whose strength lay not in perfection, but in multiplication. In a summary memo preserved after the war, one German ordnance officer wrote with startling clarity, "Our designs are works of art. Theirs are tools. And tools, in the hands of millions, decide wars." The Jeep was merely the smallest example of this truth. Behind it loomed the same principle applied to aircraft, ships, tanks, even munitions. Where Germany built complexity that demanded experts, America built simplicity that empowered amateurs. Where Germany guarded precision, America democratized production at the front. The men who had tested the Jeep saw this shift not as theory, but as daily reality. They watched columns of American vehicles moving with relentless regularity, trucks, ambulances, tanks, all built to the same philosophy. Nothing beautiful. Everything functional. The mechanic who had first examined the captured Jeep later summed it up in his final field note. They fight with factories as much as with soldiers. Every bolt is a bullet, every machine a weapon of quantity. He paused before sending the report, aware that he was writing more than a technical assessment. It was, in its own way, an obituary for the old German idea that perfection alone could prevail. The Jeep, small and unassuming, had revealed something far greater than its engine or frame. It had exposed the industrial soul of the enemy and, in doing so, foretold the outcome of the war. They were astonished, not by what the Americans had, but by how effortlessly they used it. At Oran, the captured mechanics observed rows upon rows of trucks, Jeeps and half-tracks, each one running, fueled, and maintained as if by instinct. There were no officers overseeing every motion, no elaborate procedures or forms to fill out. Young American sergeants, some barely out of school, directed entire convoys with quiet confidence. Tools were passed, engines tuned, oil changed. Parts swapped all with a rhythm that spoke of routine rather than strain. One German corporal, a former Mercedes engineer, watched in silence as a Jeep engine was replaced in under an hour. Finally, he muttered to his companion, "We would need a workshop, a crane, and a week." If the American mechanic, hearing the comment through an interpreter, only grinned and said, "Nah, just coffee and daylight." For the captured men, this was as disorienting as defeat itself. They had entered the war believing that German precision would always triumph over crude mass production. Yet here they were, surrounded by thousands of machines that embodied the opposite principle. And watching it work, they began to realize that what they had thought of as industrial chaos was, in fact, a kind of genius. American logistics did not depend on perfection. It depended on abundance. When a part failed, it was replaced, not repaired. When a vehicle broke down, another took its place. The system was resilient, precisely because it did not rely on fragile excellence. In a captured diary later recovered from a German officer, a single line summarized the revelation shared by thousands of prisoners. "We built machines to last forever. They built machines to win now, and now has defeated forever." For the engineers among them, the lesson would linger long after the war's end. Many would later admit that their true education in modern engineering began not in the factories of Stuttgart or Wolfsburg, but in the prisoner camps of North Africa. Surrounded by the relentless hum of American engines, Those engines, like the Jeep itself, represented a new era, one in which the power of a nation was measured not by the complexity of its machines, but by the simplicity with which it could build, maintain, and replace them by the millions. He turned the pages slowly, disbelief softening into reluctant admiration. Each illustration was clean, each step numbered, every torque value or clearance presented in plain language, no jargon, no assumption of expertise. It was engineering translated into common sense. The sergeant flipped a wrench, tapped between his fingers, and nodded toward the Jeep's open chassis. "We don't build for mechanics," he said. "We build for soldiers. They're tired, dirty, half-trained, and they need this thing to work now. That's the whole philosophy." The German ran his hand along the block, noting the standardized fasteners, the simple wiring harness, the modular layout. "You make it foolproof," he said quietly. "Close enough," the sergeant replied. "Foolproof don't exist, but we try." He gestured toward a row of supply crates marked with stenciled numbers. "See those? Same part numbers, coast to coast. Doesn't matter if it comes from Detroit or Dallas, it fits. We don't care who builds it, as long as it bolts on." The German paused, realizing the deeper implication. This wasn't just a motor pool, it was a manifestation of an entire national system, one where every factory, every worker, every assembly line was synchronized through simplicity. The sergeant must have seen the thought forming, because he grinned again. "We call it interchangeability. Old idea, really. But we made it religion." He pointed to a Jeep waiting for inspection. "That one just came in from Tunisia. Needs a new clutch. Watch this." Two privates set to work with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, the gearbox was unbolted, the clutch swapped, the Jeep reassembled. No hoists, no calibration tools, no engineers. Just wrenches, muscle, and clear instructions. The German could only shake his head. "In the Wehrmacht," he said softly, "this would take a day." The sergeant shrugged. "Here it's lunch break." As the sun lowered, the American handed him a cup of coffee and leaned against the fender. "You guys build beautiful machines," he said, "but we build usable ones. Out here, that's what wins." The German nodded slowly, still staring at the Jeep engine, the markings, the manual. In that moment, he understood perhaps more clearly than any report or intelligence briefing could convey that the real battlefield wasn't fought in the desert or the sky. It was fought in factories, in supply chains, in the quiet genius of making complexity simple enough for anyone to master. The German mechanic listened in silence, the sergeant's words landing like hammer blows. It wasn't arrogance. The American spoke with the easy confidence of someone who didn't realize he was describing a revolution. "Millions," the German repeated quietly, almost to himself. In his world, production was measured in dozens, sometimes hundreds. 1,000 was extraordinary. Millions was unthinkable. The sergeant nodded, taking a sip from his tin mug. "Yup, whole system's built on that idea. You keep it simple, you can scale it up. Hell, our factories don't just make parts, they make machines that make parts. Once you've got that, the rest just follows." He gestured toward the row of vehicles gleaming in the North African sun. "That's how you win a long war. Not with the fanciest stuff, but with stuff that never stops coming." The German studied the trucks and Jeeps, each one nearly identical, and suddenly he saw not machines, but momentum. Every bolt, every bracket, every stamped steel panel was part of something vast and industrial tied that no precision craftsmanship could resist. Back home, German engineers still argued over tolerances measured in thousandths of a millimeter. Here, the Americans were moving mountains of steel and rubber across continents, powered by an idea so simple it was almost brutal: make everything fit. Make it easy to build, and make a lot of it. The sergeant clapped him on the shoulder. "You want to know the real secret? We don't worship machines. We worship the guy who can keep them running. The design's just there to make his job easy." The German smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "You build for the man," he said. "Damn right," the sergeant said. "The man, not the machine. You do that, and the rest takes care of itself." As the day faded, the German mechanic stood at the edge of the motor pool, watching an endless convoy roll out toward the front dozens of jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks moving in perfect, dusty rhythm. For the first time, he understood the full meaning of what he was seeing. This wasn't merely industry. It was industrial warfare. A machine built to build machines, self-replicating, inexhaustible. And as he watched the convoy vanish into the desert haze, he realized that Germany was not fighting just an army. It was fighting an entire civilization that had learned how to turn simplicity into strength, and abundance into inevitability. It was an experience none of them had anticipated, a continuation of their education in the new mechanics of war. At first, they approached the work with quiet professionalism, expecting to demonstrate their technical superiority. But soon they discovered that there was little room for superiority in a system that didn't need it. American maintenance procedures were standardized to the point of instinct. Parts arrived in clearly marked crates. Every bolt, gasket, and bearing had an identification number. Manuals were simple, illustrations precise, and every tool had its place. The German mechanics found themselves working not in a workshop, but in a production line. Repairs were broken into steps, each one repeatable and measurable. Efficiency wasn't demanded, it was designed in, one of the senior German technicians. A former engineer from Daimler-Benz confided to a fellow prisoner, "It is as if the Americans have taken the factory and moved it into the field." He wasn't wrong. The motor pool at Camp Hearne functioned as a miniature version of the entire American war machine. Every task oil change, tire replacement, engine overhaul followed a predictable rhythm. Vehicles cycled in and out with astonishing speed. Breakdowns weren't treated as failures, but as expected intervals in a larger process. Nothing stopped for long. Nothing ever truly broke. Over time, the German mechanics adapted. They began to think in terms of systems rather than machines, of procedures rather than perfection. They learned to appreciate the beauty in what once seemed crude, the elegance of clarity, the discipline of interchangeability, the quiet power of routine. By late 1944, some even trained new American recruits, their roles blurred by mutual respect. One U.S. corporal later recalled, "Those German fellows were good mechanics." But what surprised them most was how easy it all was once they learned our way. One of them said, "You've built a machine so simple, even the enemy can fix it." We laughed, but he meant it as praise. For the prisoners, the war's outcome no longer seemed mysterious. Every truck they serviced, every shipment they saw arrive on time, every replacement part drawn from an endless supply chain reinforced the same truth. Germany had mastered craftsmanship. America had mastered systems, and in a war of systems of supply, replacement, and relentless motion, the outcome had never truly been in doubt. To the German prisoners, it was both humbling and fascinating. They had been trained to treat every repair as a matter of precision, to disassemble methodically, measure tolerances, verify alignments, and restore the vehicle to its original condition. The Americans, by contrast, treated maintenance as a form of triage. The goal was not perfection, it was function. If it ran, it was good enough. If it didn't, you made it run. They watched as American mechanics worked with an ease, born of confidence rather than training. A cracked bracket was welded rather than replaced. A stripped bolt was simply upside. A leaking seal was patched with improvised gaskets cut from rubber sheeting. It wasn't elegant, but it worked fast. One German corporal, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, summed up the difference one afternoon as he watched a team of Americans replace transmission with a borrowed hoist and a length of chain. "We repair," he said quietly. "They restore function. There is a difference." Then weeks, even the most skeptical German mechanics began to adopt American habits. They learned to value time as much as precision, to view spare parts not as sacred but as interchangeable means to an end. The result was undeniable. Vehicles left the motor pool faster, and more of them stayed operational. The American sergeant overseeing the camp's maintenance yard took quiet pride in this transformation. "You guys build great cars," he told one of the German engineers over coffee. We just make sure ours don't quit. Out here, that's all that counts. By 1945, the German prisoners at Camp Hearne had seen the American system from the inside. They had lived inside its rhythm. Supply, repair, replace, repeat. They came to understand that the true American innovation wasn't mechanical at all. It was philosophical. The U.S. Army's vehicles were extensions of an industrial culture that valued adaptability over artistry, speed over precision, and scale over perfection. It was a system designed for a world in motion, where the ability to keep going mattered. It's more than the beauty of how. And as the war drew to a close, many of those same German mechanics would later admit, often with quiet admiration, that America's greatest weapon had not been its tanks, its planes, or even its factories. It had been its attitude, the belief that anything could be fixed, rebuilt, or replaced. So long as you never stopped moving forward, the German mechanic listened, absorbing every word with a mix of awe and disbelief. What he had learned in North Africa and in Camp Hearne was now being confirmed in detail by someone who had lived it. So it's not magic, he murmured, just systematized repetition. The American nodded, a grin spreading under his sun-creased face. Exactly. Complexity isn't the goal. Predictability is. You take a complicated machine, break it into bite-sized tasks, and train enough people to do each one over and over. Then scale it up. That's how we get one bomber an hour, thousands of jeeps a week, and trucks that never stop moving. The German ran his hand over a stock of spare parts stacked neatly in the warehouse. Everything was clearly labeled, identical and abundant. Back home, he said quietly, we guard parts like treasure. If something breaks, it could take weeks to replace because each component is unique. That's the difference, the American said, eyes bright. Our stuff isn't perfect, but if it breaks, we replace it. And if the replacement breaks, we replace that. Keep it moving. Simple rules, huge results. He leaned against a crate of tires. See these Jeeps? They're all the same. Willys Ford, it doesn't matter. Swap parts, swap engines, swap bodies. Same specs, same tools, same procedures. The guy who learns one model can fix them all. That's why our motor pools hum, and why we can supply entire armies across continents without breaking a sweat. The German mechanic paused, imagining the implications. Entire fronts supplied, thousands of vehicles rolling endlessly, maintenance simplified to a set of repeatable steps. Where German precision engineering demanded mastery, American pragmatism demanded only diligence and adherence to system. So, he said slowly, you build not for perfection, but for resilience. Damn right, the American replied. Perfection doesn't win wars. Momentum does. And momentum comes from millions of parts, millions of machines, all interchangeable, all replaceable, all moving. That's the secret, the German realized. In that quiet warehouse, among crates, parts, and engines, that he was seeing not just a manufacturing method, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about industry, war, and logistics that Germany had never fully grasped. And now, having lived it, he understood why the tide of the war had turned not solely through battle, but through the relentless power of systems designed to keep going. The German mechanic stared at the camp's notice boards, at the snippets of news, the maps, and the reports that filtered in. It was a moment of clarity, one that tied together everything he had seen in North Africa, at Camp Hearne, and in the American motor pools. He thought of the Wehrmacht's sprawling vehicle inventory, dozens of truck types, each from a different manufacturer, each demanding its own spare parts, its own maintenance knowledge. Command cars sourced haphazardly, captured vehicles cobbled into service, and the Kübelwagens' sophisticated but limited design. The logistical nightmare had always been hidden behind doctrine and bravado, but the reality was now undeniable. Contrast that with the Americans. Uniformity ruled every aspect. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, amphibious vehicles all built to standardized specifications, designed from the outset for mass production, maintenance, and interchangeability. The genius was apparent in hindsight, The 1940 Jeep prototype had been produced in 49 days. Even though the official requirement allowed 75, the design was simple, functional, and built for scale, not elegance. Every bolt, every engine component, every chassis member had been optimized for repeatable assembly. The captured mechanics realized something they had never truly grasped. Sophistication could no longer dictate victory. Elegance might produce a fine vehicle, but simplicity produced armies. By the time Operation Overlord was underway, the scale of American production had translated directly into battlefield dominance. Thousands of vehicles in the first wave, all fully maintained, all interchangeable, all functional. Landing craft, trucks, tanks, amphibious vehicles, each manufactured in numbers Germany could not hope to match. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, and the numbers only grew. Within weeks, millions of Allied soldiers were fighting in Europe, all supplied and sustained by a system that Germany had never developed. The prisoners reflected on their pre-war confidence in victory. Everything they had believed about German engineering superiority, precision, and craftsmanship now seemed insufficient in the face of industrial scale and logistical mastery. One of the German mechanics finally spoke quietly to a fellow prisoner. "We thought we were the best. That quality alone would win. But they build quantity with purpose. They don't make perfection, they make power. And power doesn't stop." It was a revelation that would linger long after the war ended. The captured Jeep, once a curiosity and a subject of technical admiration, had become a symbol of simplicity outpacing sophistication, of systems outpacing individual skill, of a nation capable of turning mass production into an unstoppable weapon. The German mechanic watched the convoy of Jeeps vanish down the dusty road toward the port. The scale of it slowly sinking in. Each vehicle was simple, functional, and ready for use, yet the sheer number was staggering. Dozens loaded in minutes, all destined for Europe, all replacing losses or equipping new units. One moment crystallized the difference he had observed over 2 years. The Americans didn't rely on the brilliance of one machine or one driver, they relied on thousands of machines, moving constantly, supported by a system designed to never stop. He thought back to German assumptions about technological superiority. Yes, German tanks were formidable, aircraft sophisticated, and small arms excellent. In isolation, these machines were masterpieces. But mastery in a few designs could not counter the relentless multiplication of simpler, adequate machines. 5 American tanks for every German, 10 trucks, 100 Jeeps. The arithmetic was undeniable. Quantity, combined with practicality, had become a force multiplier. Inside the motor pool, the German mechanic reflected on what he had seen. Young privates driving Jeeps up ramps with calm certainty. Mechanics swapping parts with speed and accuracy. Vehicles flowing out to supply lines faster than German divisions had ever possessed in total. Each operation, while ordinary for the Americans, represented a scale that Germany could not hope to match. The disparity was deeper than numbers. It was philosophy. German vehicles were designed for perfection, precise tolerances, sophisticated systems, carefully engineered performance. But that same precision became a vulnerability. Maintenance required specialists. Repairs took time, and the logistics of spare parts were nightmarish. The Americans, by contrast, engineered vehicles for reality. Rugged, simple, interchangeable, and easy to repair under combat conditions by any soldier. The German mechanic shook his head slowly. The lesson was clear, though bitter. Technological superiority mattered little when overwhelmed by industrial capacity. Germany had built masterpieces that could be counted on one hand. America had built millions of tools that worked, and in total war, that was all that mattered. For the first time, he understood what had really determined the outcome of the war. Not genius or perfection, but scale, simplicity, and the relentless application of production power. The news filtered slowly through the camp. each update layering another piece onto the prisoners' growing understanding of the war's final months. The Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's desperate gamble, exposed the stark reality that German industry could no longer sustain modern warfare. Even elite units like Otto Skorzeny's commandos, renowned for audacity and ingenuity, were forced to rely on captured American vehicles, uniforms, and identification to attempt infiltration. That Germany's best operatives needed American equipment revealed the depth of the logistical collapse. When Operation Grief failed, it underscored the difference between innovation and industrial capacity. Cleverness could not substitute for production. The Ardennes Offensive itself became a cautionary tale in numbers and supply. Tanks abandoned on frozen roads, infantry forced back to horses, fuel trucks that never arrived. These were not failures of courage or tactics, but failures of material. Even the most disciplined soldiers could do nothing when the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, fuel, vehicles, and repairable machines was gone. By January 1945, the German counteroffensive had been contained and reversed. Reports reached the camp that entire divisions had disintegrated under logistical strain. By spring, the collapse was total. The Red Army pressed on Berlin from the east. Western allies pushed from the west. And what had once seemed an invincible war machine crumbled under the weight of its own inability to sustain itself. For the prisoners who had witnessed American production firsthand, none of it was a surprise. The failure of Operation Grief, the stalling of the Ardennes Offensive, and the abandonment of German tanks were simply the inevitable outcomes of a mismatch not in tactics, but in industrial philosophy. Germany had built exceptional machines that could be destroyed, but the Americans had built systems that could not be stopped. In that final spring, as Germany fell, the lesson the prisoners had learned over years of observation crystallized completely. Victory in modern war belonged not to the most ingenious designs, nor the bravest soldiers, but to the nation that could produce, maintain, and replace enough to keep the fight going until the enemy ran out of capacity to resist. The motor pool was quiet that afternoon. The hum of engines and clatter of tools reduced to a steady rhythm rather than urgency. The German mechanics moved methodically, keeping vehicles running for an army that had defeated their homeland. There was no pride in victory here, no sense of accomplishment, tonally the sober recognition of reality. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because it had challenged nations whose industrial capacity it could never match. The news of Germany's surrender carried a muted weight. The American soldiers' words were simple, factual. War's over in Europe? The mechanics nodded, unsurprised. Months of observation, of labor, of quiet reflection had already prepared them for this outcome. What happens to us now? One asked. You'll go home eventually, the American replied. Probably not immediately. Lots of logistics to work out, but you'll go home. The mechanic considered this, imagining a Germany that had been bombed into rubble, occupied by foreign armies. Its cities destroyed by the same manufacturing might that had produced the Jeep he had examined years ago. The American paused, sizing him up. You a smart guy? Did you really think Germany could win? The mechanic exhaled slowly. Before the war, we believed German quality could overcome American quantity. We had seen American products before the war. Many were inferior to our equivalents. We assumed American military equipment would be the same. But it wasn't. No. When we examined that first Jeep in '42, we realized we had made a fundamental error. We had confused peacetime quality with wartime effectiveness. Your Jeep wasn't better engineered than our Kübelwagen, in absolute terms. It was better designed for mass production and field conditions. In total war, that proved decisive. The American nodded knowingly. Yeah, we build adequate products quickly and in huge quantities. Exactly, the mechanic replied. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two men from opposing sides, united by shared understanding. The war had been fought on battlefields, in skies, and across deserts, but its outcome had been determined long before by the quiet genius of systems industrial scale, standardized production, and the relentless application of logistics. In late 1945, the repatriation process began. German mechanics returned to a homeland that bore the scars of defeat and the echoes of lessons learned abroad. They carried knowledge that would shape post-war industry, engineering, and logistics in education born in captivity, forged in observation and illuminated by a single, unassuming vehicle, the Jeep. The mechanic settled into his new routine with a mixture of pragmatism and reflection. Each day he oversaw rows of American vehicles, Jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks, moving steadily through the motor pool. He guided his trainees with patient precision, showing them how to diagnose problems quickly, swap parts efficiently, and improvise when necessary. The lessons he imparted were simple but profound. A vehicle doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to run. He watched young Germans, some of them former soldiers, approach engines and drivetrains with wariness at first, then growing confidence as they grasped the philosophy behind American maintenance. Tools were standardized, parts were interchangeable, manuals were clear, and mistakes were part of learning. Remember, he would tell them, we build function, not art. A broken part replaced is better than a perfect part waiting for repair. Beyond the motor pool, he observed the city of Bremen slowly coming back to life. American trucks delivered food, medicine, and construction materials. Workers and planners coordinated logistics with the same disciplined efficiency that had sustained armies in the war. Streets cleared of rubble, schools reopened, and businesses began to function again. Reconstruction was a mechanized process as much as a human one. Guided by principles he had long observed, systems that worked, redundancy that ensured continuity, and simplicity that allowed rapid scaling, he reflected often on the arc of his own journey from Afrika Korps mechanic to prisoner to motor pool instructor in occupied Germany. The Jeep, once a symbol of enemy ingenuity, had become a teaching tool, a reminder of what truly mattered in machinery and in life: reliability, adaptability, and the ability to keep moving forward. And in imparting these lessons, he realized he was doing more than teaching mechanics. He was contributing to a nation learning to rebuild, using the same principles that had once ensured victory: simplicity over sophistication, function over perfection, and results over theory. The war was over, but its lessons, industrial, logistical, and human, lived on in every vehicle, every workshop, and every mechanic he trained. The mechanic sipped his drink and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the deserts of North Africa to the motor pools of Texas, from prisoner to teacher, he had accumulated lessons few of his peers could comprehend. Now, in post-war Germany, those lessons were poised to shape the nation's recovery. His vision for a German vehicle drew directly from what he had learned: simplicity, interchangeability, and durability, without sacrificing suitability for European roads. He imagined a vehicle smaller than the Jeep, more fuel-efficient, yet retaining the rugged reliability that had allowed American machines to operate in every terrain. The philosophy was clear: designed for the people who would maintain it, for factories that would produce it, for conditions that demanded resilience over elegance. The American captain listened intently. Marshall Plan money will rebuild German manufacturing, he said. Engineers here are studying your methods. The future is going to be American-style mass production, adapted for local conditions. Indeed, history would validate that assessment. West German industry embraced the fusion of American pragmatism and German engineering precision. Volkswagen, once the producer of the Kübelwagen, became a global automotive giant, mastering both quality and scalability. The Beetle, in particular, embodied this synthesis: simple, reliable, mass-producible, and affordable for everyday families worldwide. The knowledge carried by former Wehrmacht mechanics became a hidden engine of reconstruction. They understood component standardization, saw the power of efficient parts distribution, and had lived the benefits of simplified maintenance procedures. More than that, they internalized a crucial principle: designing for manufacturability rather than perfection, enabled production at scales Germany had never achieved during the war, as they trained new generations of engineers and mechanics. These men quietly propagated lessons learned under duress. American ingenuity had been observed firsthand, dissected, and repurposed. The result was a manufacturing culture that valued both quality and quantity, precision and practicality. By the 1950s and 60s, German vehicles Volkswagens, Audis, and later BMWs and Mercedes reflected this philosophy, technically advanced yet universally maintainable, capable of mass production without sacrificing reliability. In the end, the Jeep that had once bewildered German mechanics in the deserts of North Africa became more than a vehicle. It was a symbol and a blueprint. Its legacy endured in every assembly line, every standardized bolt, and every reliable car that rolled out of post-war Germany, driving a nation from ruin to prosperity. The legacy of the Jeep extended far beyond its role on the battlefield. German manufacturers emerging from the post-war ruins recognized that trying to recreate pre-war methods, meticulous, highly specialized, and production-limited, would not suffice in a world increasingly shaped by mass production. Instead, they synthesized two philosophies: the precision and engineering rigor of German tradition with the scale, standardization and simplicity of American methods. By the early 1950s, the results were striking. Volkswagen ramped production from mere thousands to hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually. Mercedes-Benz adapted assembly line techniques while maintaining its signature quality standards. BMW emphasized component commonality across model lines, reducing complexity and streamlining logistics. These changes fueled West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, transforming it into a global export powerhouse, with vehicles renowned for both reliability and affordability. Historians later traced the roots of this transformation. Two lessons learned during the war. U.S. Army historian Hugh M. recorded that German military leaders, reflecting on the conflict, admired the Jeep more than any other American weapon system, not the B-17s, not the Sherman tanks, not the artillery. The Jeep was revered because it exemplified the philosophy that had won the war: simplicity, standardization, and manufacturability over sheer technical sophistication. General George C. Marshall famously described the Jeep as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare, a judgment that extended beyond combat to logistics industry and post-war reconstruction. The practical implications were clear. By November 1943, the U.S. Army had compiled exhaustive data on captured Kübelwagens. Publishing Technical Manual TME 92803 on June 6, 1944. D-Day allowing American forces to operate and maintain any German vehicle they captured. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, never produced an equivalent manual for the Jeep, nor was it needed. The Jeep's design was intuitive, its components standardized, and its operation so straightforward that any soldier or mechanic could quickly adapt. In effect, the Jeep became a symbol and a template. It was not just a tool of war, but a blueprint for production philosophy. Its influence rippled into post-war German industry, shaping assembly lines, logistics systems, and vehicle design for decades. The marriage of German precision and American pragmatism that it inspired produced products neither nation's pre-war philosophy could have achieved alone, a testament to the enduring power of simplicity, standardization, and practical engineering. The conversation at that reunion carried the weight of decades, of reflection tempered by experience. Memories of desert sands, mud-choked roads, the endless grind of maintenance colored every statement. One of the former mechanics leaned forward. The Kübelwagen was superior in engineering, he said. Lighter, fuel-efficient, especially for desert conditions, air-cooled engine was brilliant. But brilliance alone doesn't win wars. The Jeep. The Jeep was designed for modern war. Four-wheel drive, parts interchangeable, maintenance anyone could manage, produced in numbers we could never hope to match. That's what made it decisive. An old reconnaissance officer nodded, his voice low with recollection. I remember capturing my first Jeep in '41. We thought it crude, almost primitive compared to our vehicles. Took us months to see it for what it was. Simple, yes. But that simplicity was a kind of elegant sufficiency built for the field. By '43, every unit wanted captured Jeeps. They worked better under the conditions we faced every day, another former soldier added. We measured engineering by specifications, tolerances, and design brilliance. But the Americans measured by results vehicles that stayed running. That could be fixed by anyone. That could be produced endlessly. In the end, results mattered more than perfection. The group fell into a reflective silence. Years of fighting, losing, observing had crystallized a lesson that textbooks and manuals could never fully convey. In total war, the practical, producible, and maintainable often outweighed the technically superior. The Jeep had become more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of a philosophy that had reshaped the battlefield and, eventually, the world of manufacturing. One former mechanic smiled wryly. We studied German engineering all our lives, admired it even. But the Americans? They taught us something we didn't learn in any academy. They showed that simplicity, scale, and adaptability can be more powerful than perfection. And in that quiet room of memories, the captured Jeep lived on not as a machine, but as a lesson in design, production, and the inexorable logic of industrial power. Another veteran nodded solemnly. The worst moment for me, he said, was realizing that America produced more Jeeps in a single week than Germany could build Kübelwagens in an entire year. That's when the truth hit me. It wasn't a single battle, a single tank, or a single maneuver that doomed us. It was mathematics. They could replace losses faster than we could inflict them. The consensus among these veterans was clear. German soldiers had immense respect for the Kübelwagen, as a vehicle's engineering was precise. Its design suited to certain terrains, but it could not match what the Jeep represented. A philosophy of production, simplicity, and replaceability that Germany had never achieved. The Jeep's value was as much in what it revealed about American manufacturing capacity as in its combat effectiveness. The logistical disparities were stark. By 1943, roughly 80% of German divisions relied on horse-drawn transport. Germany had entered the war with 514,000 horses and eventually employed 2.75 million horses and mules. With approximately 1.1 million in active service at any given time, over 2 million of these animals would die over the course of the conflict. In contrast, every American division was fully motorized. Trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks carried troops, artillery, and supplies mechanized logistics that allowed operational flexibility. German commanders could only envy, one of the former officers reflected. Our horses could not move fast enough, could not carry enough, and required food and care that stretched our supply lines to breaking. The Americans. They didn't just fight battles. They moved entire armies with precision, speed, and consistency we could never match. It was a lesson that lingered long after the war. Combat skill and engineering prowess mattered, but in total war, the decisive factor was the ability to sustain forces, replace losses, and project power continuously. The Jeep, simple and unassuming, had become the symbol of that advantage. Its existence a daily reminder of the industrial reality Germany had never overcome. The contrast in mobility between the opposing armies was stark. American supply columns could cover hundreds of kilometers in a single day, moving men, equipment, and fuel with remarkable efficiency. German supply lines, dependent on horses, were constrained by animal endurance, averaging barely 30 kilometers per day under ideal conditions. The difference was more than logistical. It shaped the outcome of campaigns. When Wehrmacht generals later analyzed their defeat, the conclusion was consistent. Failure stemmed not from courage, tactics, or strategy, but from industrial limitations. German soldiers fought bravely, and their officers generally made sound tactical choices. Yet German industry could not produce enough vehicles, fuel, or spare parts to match the relentless output of American and Allied forces. In this context, the Jeep became emblematic of the disparity. Every German soldier who encountered one immediately grasped what it represented: a machine so abundant that Americans treated it as disposable, so reliable that minimal maintenance sufficed, so simple that any soldier could operate and repair it, and so effective that captured Jeeps were preferred over the German vehicles themselves whenever possible. It was a symbol not of ingenuity alone, but of the industrial and logistical power that ultimately decided the war. The Jeep's impact endured long after 1945. In 1976, the United States Army began replacing it with the HMMWV. After a remarkable 35 years of service and extraordinary lifespan for any military vehicle, many Jeeps continued to serve in reserve units and Allied militaries for decades beyond that. A testament not only to their design, but to the enduring lessons of simplicity, reliability, and production-minded engineering that had first made them decisive on the battlefields of World War II. The veterans circled the restored Willys MB Jeep in the museum, their eyes tracing the curves and rivets with a mixture of nostalgia and professional admiration. These were men who had once raced across the deserts of North Africa, whose hands had tightened bolts under the harshest conditions, whose minds had absorbed lessons in mechanics that few civilians could comprehend. One veteran extended his arthritic fingers to the hood. "I captured one of these in '42, he said slowly, reverence in his voice. "Used it for 3 months before I got wounded at El Alamein. Best vehicle I ever drove. Better than anything we had." Another veteran, nodding in agreement, added, "I examined one in Tunisia just before we surrendered. Couldn't believe how simple the design was. That's when I realized we'd been approaching vehicle design all wrong. Too complicated." A quiet understanding passed between them. It was not just the Jeep's rugged reliability or its ability to traverse impossible terrain. It was the philosophy it represented. Designed for mass production, simplicity, maintainability, and adaptability. Principles that had not only won battles, but had ultimately influenced the rebirth of German industry and the post-war automotive miracle. They lingered around the vehicle, recalling long-forgotten moments. A lever shifted to engage four-wheel drive. A stubborn engine block that yielded to patient hands. The endless stream of spare parts that made repairs almost trivial. In the stillness of the museum, decades after the war, the Jeep was more than a vehicle, it was a teacher. And for these elderly veterans, the lesson was complete. Ingenuity alone could not overcome scale, standardization, and practicality. The Jeep had been their adversary, their benchmark, and ultimately, the embodiment of the industrial thinking that had reshaped the world they returned to after the war. Each man walked away with a quiet respect. A final salute to a machine that had quietly changed history. The veterans stood quietly. The Jeep before them, more than a museum piece, it was a teacher, a symbol, a reminder. One spoke, his voice tinged with lingering awe, too difficult to produce and maintain. "They made over 600,000 of them," another added matter-of-factly. "We made 50,000 Kübelwagens." That ratio told you everything. The group fell silent, each man reflecting on the years long past. The Jeep's war was over. But for them it represented something more enduring than combat. The industrial capacity that had defeated them. The functional engineering that had proved decisive. The sheer abundance that had overwhelmed scarcity. Finally, one veteran said almost to himself, "We never had vehicles like this. Not in the numbers, not with the reliability, not designed with the same philosophy. We built for perfection. They built for production." That lesson had been learned painfully in deserts, mountains, and fields across Europe. German mechanics had examined captured Jeeps in North Africa, Italy, and France, discovering that victory did not rely solely on technical sophistication, but on systems that could be produced, maintained, and deployed at scale. The knowledge acquired under duress became the foundation for post-war Germany. The defeat had taught humility. American equipment had taught functional, practical engineering. Together, these lessons reshaped German industrial philosophy, producing vehicles and factories that combined precision with mass producibility. The story of Wehrmacht, mechanics, and the Jeep was a story of learning through defeat. Pride had whispered that German engineering alone would prevail, that quality would trump quantity, that sophistication could overcome simplicity. Reality had taught them otherwise. And from that reality, Germany built a new approach, one that powered reconstruction, economic revival, and eventual prosperity. The Jeep, simple, unassuming, and abundant, had endured not just as a vehicle of war, but as a lesson in industrial wisdom, legacy that reshaped both a nation and the way the world thought about design, production, and the power of practical engineering. American vehicles were not inherently superior in technical specifications. German tanks and trucks often outperformed them on paper, but they were better, adapted to the practical realities of modern warfare. They were designed to be produced in vast quantities, maintained by minimally trained personnel, constructed with standardized, interchangeable parts, capable of surviving abuse in the field. When multiplied by America's industrial capacity, this functional design philosophy created material superiority that no amount of German skill, bravery, or tactical ingenuity could overcome. The Wehrmacht possessed highly trained soldiers, competent officers, and sophisticated equipment. Yet it lacked the structural foundation to sustain a war against an opponent capable of producing and replacing equipment faster than Germany could destroy it. German mechanics who had hands-on experience with both German and American vehicles understood this intimately. They had seen the limitations of precision-engineered but production-limited systems, and they had witnessed the efficiency and durability of vehicles designed for mass production and field service. When these mechanics returned to post-war Germany, they brought more than technical skill. They carried the lessons learned under the harshest conditions. In training new mechanics, they emphasized simplicity, standardization, and reliability. In consulting on production processes, they advocated for interchangeable parts and streamlined assembly. When designing new vehicles and machinery, they prioritized manufacturability and field robustness over unnecessary sophistication. Engineers who rebuilt the German automotive and industrial sectors combined these insights with traditional German precision, creating a hybrid approach, meticulous engineering executed at scale. Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW exemplified this synthesis, producing vehicles that were both highly reliable and efficiently manufactured. By the 1970s, West Germany had become a leading global exporter of manufactured goods, demonstrating that lessons learned through defeat could be transformed into enduring strength. In essence, Germany's post-war success validated the principle that studying the victor and adapting their methods was more effective than clinging to pre-war hubris. Precision alone could not sustain victory. Practical, scalable, and maintainable engineering, combined with mass production, proved decisive in war and foundational in peace. The Jeep's influence extended far beyond the battlefield, embedding itself in the minds of those who encountered it. Every Wehrmacht mechanic who maintained a captured Jeep internalized lessons about American design philosophy, simplicity, interchangeability, and robustness under field conditions. Every officer who rode in one recognized how easily it operated, how effectively it performed, and how quickly it could be repaired. Every soldier who saw the sheer abundance of Allied vehicles understood a reality that wartime propaganda had tried to obscure. Germany could not match the industrial output of its adversaries. These observations, repeated across hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and prisoners, created a widespread recognition that defeat had been determined not by courage or tactics, but by material capacity. This collective understanding would later shape post-war reconstruction efforts. German leaders and engineers, reflecting on what had been learned, sought to adapt American methods rather than attempt to revive pre-war approaches that had proven inadequate. The emphasis shifted to mass production. Instead of small-scale craftsmanship, designing for manufacturability and reliability rather than pursuing perfection at the cost of speed or scalability. The Wehrmacht mechanics who first encountered Jeeps in the deserts of North Africa were initially focused on assessing an enemy vehicle's utility. Yet in that process, they uncovered deeper truths about industrial philosophy and production. Strategy truths that would guide their work for decades. Influenced post-war industry, contributed to Germany's eventual economic recovery and global manufacturing prominence. In that sense, the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was an unwitting teacher. Its design and ubiquity demonstrated the power of production-minded engineering, and the lessons it imparted reshaped an entire nation's approach to technology, logistics, and industry. The last of those Wehrmacht mechanics have now passed. Their voices silenced by time, but the lessons they absorbed endure. Every vehicle designed for ease of manufacture carries echoes of the philosophy the Jeep embodied. Every standardized part reflects the influence of American production methods. Every emphasis on reliability, maintainability, and practicality traces back to those motor pools where German mechanics labored over captured American equipment. Learning lessons that could not be taught in textbooks, the Jeep's legacy is not measured in horsepower. Or armor it is a teacher of principles. It taught that assumptions of inherent superiority demand scrutiny, that functional effectiveness outweighs complexity, and that designing for manufacturability and field repair produces results far more enduring than designing for theoretical perfection. Those lessons shaped the reconstruction of Germany, guiding engineers and mechanics to build vehicles, factories, and industries capable of sustaining both civilian and military production in ways pre-war methods never could. The mechanics who once marveled at the Jeep in the deserts of North Africa became architects of renewal. Their humility, forged in defeat and tempered by observation, served Germany better than the pride that had preceded catastrophe. In November 1942, when a group of Wehrmacht mechanics first examined a captured Jeep, they did not yet know the full extent of what they were learning. They only knew that they had never seen a vehicle like it. That admission, the recognition that a simple, practical design could outmatch sophisticated engineering in real-world conditions, marked the beginning of wisdom that would rebuild a nation and influence generations of engineers worldwide. The Jeep, unassuming yet revolutionary, had done more than serve in war. It had become a teacher, a symbol of industrial insight, and a catalyst for transformation that reached far beyond the battlefield.